And like I said, yes, she comes from us from ETH Zurich. And she, was appointed to the chair of Sustainability Assessment of Food and Agricultural Systems at the TOM in 2023. And so we're very lucky to have her. She's a very young professor. She beats me for the youngest professor here. So congratulations. Yeah. And we welcome you to the floor. So to your talk.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Monica, for this kind introduction. And I'm really glad to be here this evening in this special environment and give you an overview on sustainability of food and agricultural systems. In particular, I want to show you how food and agricultural systems affect sustainability, where we'll have a particular focus actually on the environmental dimension of sustainability. Also, I want you to understand how we can quantitatively assess sustainability within food and agriculture systems with a methodology that is called life cycle assessment, by showing you some illustrative case studies. Also, I want you to show why we should always take the international dimension into account, like a globalization of international supply chains, and how this affects also the sustainability of food and agricultural systems. And finally, the goal is also to understand how this methodology life cycle assessment can guide us here with sustainable solutions, sustainable decision making. And to start with the first question, how do food and agriculture systems affect sustainability? I also would like to do this a bit in the form of a quiz, like actually through the entire presentation. And there will always be some questions where you can also vote. So please scan this code. And the task here is just to guess which of the statements here are true or wrong. And actually now it doesn't work anymore with going forward. Now it works again. Yeah, perfect. So the first statement is that out of all people living in extreme poverty, almost 2/3 of these people are working in agriculture. Second point is actually we would produce enough food for everyone on the globe, but still 800 million people, that's about 10 times the population of Germany, are suffering from hunger. Then you can always see which of the SDGs it's affecting, like also, for instance, reduced inequalities. Then a third of all the food we produce is lost or wasted along the different steps in the life cycle of food systems. And we have several statements about the environmental dimension, like food and agriculture systems account for 90% of global water stress, 80% of biodiversity impacts because of land use activities, which is the main driver of biodiversity impacts, 70% of eutrophication effects because of nitrogen and phosphorus emissions, and up to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, could we move to the quiz mode? I think now you can just press on this, show you, like here. Did anyone already vote?
Yeah, you can see the questions. Then you just started it. Like, I can like. Yeah, I can like, but nothing.
Okay. Sorry, can I quickly check? So the just for half an hour with work.
No, we're not. I don't think anyone is.
Okay, yeah, then let's do it just interactively. Anyone would like to make a guess who thinks statement A is true? Please hold your hand. That was the people living in extreme poverty. Statement B, that there's 800 million people suffer from hunger, although we produce enough for everyone. Then answer C, a third of global food is wasted. Answer D, they contribute to 80% of biodiversity impacts. Who thinks that they contribute to more than 70% of eutrophication?
More than.
And a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, up to a third. So we always had around of 2/3 of the hands up, and actually, yeah, you may also assume it already. It's actually all of the statements are true. So just to show you that food and agriculture systems play a really important role here. Then can we go to the next slide? So what you can see now on the y-axis is the global greenhouse gas emissions over the time. Now, not only for food and agriculture systems, but actually for all global activities. We see here now the biomass sector that includes the food and agriculture systems contributing about up to a third. And actually what you can also see here is the planetary boundary. These are the greenhouse gas emissions that we could emit to stay within the boundary of 1.5 degrees. So a key conclusion here is we are overshooting a lot with this trend here, rising greenhouse gas emissions, decreasing planetary boundary. So just as an example, what the current state is actually, and it also looks similar for biodiversity impacts, where we are also overshooting a lot, with the difference that this is almost exclusively because of food and agricultural systems. So I guess we all agree that we definitely need to change here the track, because the trends are going into the wrong direction. And for this, we also need to understand the drivers behind it. So what is actually driving the rising greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity impacts? And also a question here, is it, how can we reduce it then? And for this, we need to understand, for instance, our first question to understand here is, what you can see now here is are the climate impacts per capita and the biodiversity impacts per capita. And you can see it now divided by the income group. And now one may assume that if, for instance, technical solutions may decrease greenhouse gas emissions, it would mean that higher income regions would have lower footprints, right? Because in high income regions, we have a lot of clean, or we could assume we have a lot of clean technology. So actually that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. While in low income regions, we have the opposite pattern. However, we also have an opposite effect. Like in high income regions, we also consume a lot of commodities. And this, on the other hand, has a rising effect on the greenhouse gas emissions. And my question to you is now, what do you think, which income class has the highest impacts? Let's say for greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita level. Who thinks it's the high income region? Who thinks it's the upper and middle income region? Yeah, so that would be, for instance, China. Who thinks it's the lower income regions? And the very low income region? Anyone? Okay, so Actually, we see here a very clear pattern of the higher the income, the higher the impacts. Actually, for all types of impact categories like greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity impacts, and we also see it for almost every sector actually, except the construction sector. And this is because of the rising infrastructure in China, while our infrastructure is already built up. And we also see it, for instance, for food, that the richer we are, we have more efficient systems. However, we disproportionately consume more, resulting also in a higher food footprint. And what also is obvious, that when we become richer, of course, we can consume some more food, but actually this part here, the non-food part, grows even more because there is a higher elasticity, like to live in larger spaces or to travel more. And I guess after seeing this picture, we also all agree that we need some sustainable solutions also with regard to production and consumption patterns in long term. And here, life cycle assessment can give us some guidance on which products should we consume, or what scenarios might be, future pathways that we can follow to stay within the planetary boundaries. And here I just want to briefly guide you through the steps that you can understand the results afterwards better. So the principle is always you define you define a product that you want to assess, can be a beer or can be a diet, for instance. And then you look at the entire life cycle from cultivating, let's say, the crops that we also need in beer, or the animal farming that is fed some feed, some soy, the further processing, transporting, retailing, consumption, disposal, and possibly recycling. All these steps can have an impact on the environment. And then in the second step, you look at all the different inputs and outputs that are released along these different steps, like the greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, or the water use, or the land use, or the energy use. That is called the inventory analysis. And in the next step, you want to translate this inventory into an actual impact on the environment. Like, for instance, you take all the different greenhouse gas emissions, you measure them, you weigh them with the global warming potential, and then you know what are the total greenhouse gas emissions, as I showed you before. Or you look, for instance, at the land that is used. Where on the globe is the land used, and what is the effect on species loss? Or on human health, for instance, because of harmful substances. And usually in LCA, we always do this for the environmental dimension, as shown here, but more recently, also we try to include the socioeconomic dimension as well. That is particularly important, for instance, when we want to compare, let's say, organic food to conventional food, because then we can also consider, for instance, the ethical dimension. Now let's make an example. Let's say you are in a restaurant and you're wondering, does it really have a high effect for the climate if you choose a beef, a chicken, or a plant-based burger? So you make a life cycle assessment, and here you can skip now the bread, the salad, etc., because this is actually the same for the three of them. Also, you can skip those steps, right? Because actually just the cultivation and the farming and the processing step is here important. The rest might be the same if you compare these three options. You look at the different greenhouse gas emissions, the CO2, the methane. You may know that, for instance, cows, they release methane. We have denitrogen emissions, also because of manure treatment, for instance. You multiply each of the emission with a factor. This is around 30 times higher for methane than for CO2, around 300 times higher for denitrogen emissions, to consider the real effect on the temperature then. And then you end up with a life cycle assessment of these 3 products. And I guess you already know that by far beef has the highest impact, and while the soy-based plant-based burger is the lowest impact. And we even have here factors in between of 10. And the reason for this is that we need around 10 times more feed to we need around 10 times more soy to feed a chicken or a beef than if we just when we consume it directly. While, however, the beef we can also feed some grass, but still here we have around a factor of 10, while the beef has then such a high impact because of the methane emissions. And now if we want to reduce those emissions, it can also help us to know at which life cycle stage are the emissions released, because there we could then also act to reduce the emissions efficiently. And so also a question to you where you can make a guess. Do you think that the processes here in red, what is here dominating? Is it the land use, the farming and the feed that is dominating? Or is it the packaging, transport and processing? Who thinks it's land use, farming and feed? So yeah, that was very uniformly indeed, because actually the transport, the packaging and processing is the same for the 3 of them. Now it's again difficult for me to move forward. And then you always need to be, of course, also critical about the uncertainty. And you may wonder, is there a scenario where for instance, the plant-based burger has a higher impact than the chicken burger? Let's say if the soy is imported from Brazil, or if it's processed with coal electricity or whatever, transported with an airplane, for instance. And in LCA, we can consider this in a way that we run LCAs hundreds of times, always with different assumptions that we take. And then we can model an uncertainty range where we see then that there is indeed a scenario where the chicken burger has a lower impact than the plant-based burger, but actually the beef burger has always the highest impact. And this is just because of these methane emissions, which is something naturally and will always be released. Then another question to ask, and that you can also address with LCA, is to find out which of the burger can you consume and it's still in the planetary boundary to achieve the 2-degree target. And this is now based on the assumption that we have a certain budget left that we can release every year, around 5 gigatons. Around a third is allocated to the food. And then we divide it through the number of years, through the number of days, and through the number of meals per day, and through the world population. And when we end up with a value that shows us that actually with a plant-based burger, we're easily within that range. We could also eat several times this type of burger and then compensate, for instance, for the chicken burger. But where are we standing at the moment? Let's take the example for Germany. We are actually around 2 times higher, 2 times above what would be the target based on the climate, a 2-degree climate target. Now, we've seen so far an example for specific diets. Let's say we want to look now at Germany's entire consumption and find out what are the hotspots in our consumption causing the environmental impacts, like for greenhouse gas emissions. And for this, we can use an instrument in the LCA that is called economy-wide LCA. And this is just, also what you should just take from here is it considers the international dimension of global supply chains in a way that, let's say, we have some crops cultivation somewhere on the globe that can happen, for instance, in Latin America, then it is transported, shipped, further processed, retailed, consumed in Germany. So with this instrument, we can track these global supply chains to account for the specific way of how food is cultivated, produced abroad. We can take into account, for instance, the effect of deforestation that are happening abroad, and can then quantitatively assess the effect on the environment. Now let's take the example of land use instead of greenhouse gas emissions, and let's have a look at Germany's land use footprint. So all the land that we use on the entire globe to supply Germany's consumption with food and agricultural products. And my question to you is now, do you think we need less, equal, or more land to supply Germany's consumption of food and agricultural products? Who thinks we need less land? And who thinks we need the same amount of land? Who thinks we even need more land? Yeah, indeed, unfortunately, we even need around 50% more land than we have available. And this, by the way, also includes the land area of the mountains and cities and everything. So how could we reduce this land use footprint? And actually, even a more important question to address is how can we reduce the impact that is happening on biodiversity because of this land use? Because using land alone doesn't have to be harmful for the environment, but the problem is always if it leads to a species loss. And to address this type of question in life cycle assessment, what we do is something, it's called a regionalized biodiversity impact assessment that takes into account now species area loss function, which mean, also they describe actually how much species loss do we have where on the globe if we use 1 square meter of land for, let's say, agriculture. And actually, these species loss factors take also into account the endemic species in those regions, meaning that they are around, actually this scale is logarithmic. That means we lose around 50 or 200 times more species if we use 1 square meter of land in Brazil or in Indonesia compared to Germany, because let's say in Germany, if we use land and the species are extinct, they still exist in other countries, while in other regions, this is not the case. So if we make such an assessment in LCA, we look at where on the globe do we use this land, we multiply it with those specific factors, and then we end up with a value which so far just tells us, okay, 0.1% of all global species went extinct in that year because of Germany's consumption of food and agricultural products. Now, how can we reduce that biodiversity footprint? And for this, we need to look now into the supply chain and find out, where are the hotspots? Should we act within Germany because most of the impacts are caused here, or should we act in other regions, and actually in which countries? Now again, a question to you. What do you think? Which percentage now of this biodiversity loss, which percentage is caused abroad, not inland? Is it, do you think it's 1/3? Do you think it's 50%? Who thinks it's 90%? Yeah, indeed, it's 90%. And Let's have a closer look at these 90%. So actually what you see now on the left side will be now Germany's biodiversity loss footprint. Now is 100% shown, divided by the different regions where the impact is caused. So this means, for instance, that 9% of this impact is caused in Germany itself. Here we have the other 90%. With our models, we can also zoom into those different regions, like zoom, for instance, into Asia and Pacific, when we can see it's, for instance, Indonesia, also producing some palm oil, let's say, also a lot of rice production. Latin America, also here, Brazil, of course, is a hotspot because of beef and soy imports. Or we can also zoom into the African countries. We can look at what are the actual commodities that we are import. I will show it now to you on a very aggregated scale. You can see here now the life cycle stage that that causes the impact, where we see it's really the agriculture itself. So it's not the processing, because this hardly uses land. And then, for instance, if there is some soy fed to the animals, we can show this in the next step. Where you see now, this is the biodiversity impact of the meat, for instance, because of soy. And as a sum, we see now that actually even around half of this impact is because of consuming meat, although only 20% of the calories are supplied with it. Non-food is mostly textiles, biochemicals, for instance. And actually, when we look at the provisioning system, it's interesting to see that even half of the meat is consumed via restaurants and canteens, while the contribution of vegan products is higher. So in supermarkets, people tend to eat more plant-based than in restaurants. And so what we can conclude here is definitely we could significantly, efficiently reduce our biodiversity footprint by importing less from critical regions, instead increasing domestic production and shift to more plant-based diets. For instance, making smaller meat portions in restaurants and canteens would already be very effective. Now, also with life cycle assessment, we can make some scenario modeling to say, not only on for specific diets as for the burger before, but also to say, now let's say the entire world would shift to a more plant-based diet. Could we meet the planetary, could we stay then within the planetary boundary? Could we meet the could we meet then, for instance, the 2-degree target? And this is something a master student of me has investigated. And what he did is, also he looked at the total global greenhouse gas emissions because of food production, similar as I showed you before. You can see them here. So 8 gigatons CO2 equivalents were emitted. That was in 2015 because of producing these food items. And we see around more than half of it is because of animal-based products. Now, let's say we shift to a more plant-based diet. How much can we reduce our food carbon footprint? It's even around 60%. That is because this part here also is not produced anymore, while the plant-based diet part only increases slightly because we can also start eating the soy that is currently fed to the animals. And then he also looked at some other scenarios, like reduced meat was actually a scenario based on assumption for Switzerland, assuming that we still, for instance, consume the beef that is hauled on grassland, and still a small amount of pig and chicken, actually. Now, to my initial question, could we stay within the 2-degree target if we move to a more plant-based diet? The answer is yes. We even have here some space, so it would also be possible to still consume some animal-based products and to stay within the planetary boundary for climate here. But how it may look like for biodiversity, and Fabian Hafner also made the same assessment for biodiversity as well. So what you can see here now on this axis is the global species loss. So that means 10% of all species went extinct in 2015 because of food production and consumption. Now, if we switch to a plant-based diet, we have a similar mitigation potential. We could reduce it by 50%. Also for the remaining scenarios, it looks quite similar as for climate impacts. And what about the planetary boundary? Would you like to make a guess? Do you think if we move from here to here and we have an annual species loss from 5%, would that be still within the planetary boundary in a way that nature could recover? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Yeah, unfortunately, the planetary boundary for biodiversity is really low. And also one reason why we are overshooting here a lot is also because this indicator here really takes the endemic species loss into account. So it weights the tropical regions very heavily. And when we take a closer look at the data that are underlying these models, those estimations I just showed you, we see a picture like this, and let me explain you. So what you can see in this figure is now the biodiversity impact that happened because of land use changes. So that means the redder it becomes, the more we had patterns of, for instance, deforestation over the past 20 years, leading to an impact on biodiversity. So deforestation or other natural conservation for mostly agriculture, also some wood production. While the blue color means we have, it's actually not really a species gain, but what it means is we had a pattern of reforestation and nature conservation, like in a way that we stopped agriculture somewhere and let it regrow, for instance. And actually now when we count together all the negative values indicating a gain and all the positive values indicating a loss, we end up with a number that is actually leading to a species loss. And so this pattern is something we should actually change. So if we want to stay within this planetary boundary, we should stop deforesting in tropical regions. And how can we do this? What should we change, for instance, in our consumption behavior? And this is a question we addressed in a way that we took this assessment and we combined it with a global supply chain model, which allows us then to look at how much agricultural products are produced in all of those different regions. We look at the import, the trade pattern. We trace the export of those commodities until final consumption. And then actually what we see is that the vast majority of those additional biodiversity impacts is because of international trade. And it's not only Europe where it's blue, but it's also, we had a huge increase, for instance, in the Middle East and in China, because they started importing a lot of meat and soy from tropical regions, kind of imitating the consumption behavior that we already have for instance, in the USA and Europe. But actually, when you look then at their per capita footprint, we saw it at the beginning, the per capita biodiversity footprint is still lower in China, for instance, than in our country. Yeah, so now we're already reaching the end, and I showed you several examples on how life cycle assessment can guide sustainable decision making. And now your task again is to vote again which of these statements are true, so we can go through them together. So LCA allows for a comparison of environmental impacts of different products and processes to support industries and purchasing decisions of consumer. Who thinks that's true? Yeah, I see many people nodding. So we also had the example of the burger here. Then it also allows for identifying the environmental improvement potentials within the life cycle and supply chain of products, processes, and footprints. Also, I see you nodding. We had the example for Germany's footprint with regard to biodiversity. Then it also allows for scenario comparisons to identify optimal strategies for sustainable development. So here, what do you think? Do you think it's true? So here we had the example of the dietary changes. And it can also provide us a spatially resolved environmental impact assessment, taking local conditions like value of the ecosystem into account to support resource conservation strategies. Who thinks that's true? I hear a yes. So here we had the example of the biodiversity impact assessment that takes into account for the endemic species loss, for instance, or we can also do the same to assess water scarcity, taking into account that, for instance, in Switzerland and Germany, water isn't that scarce, but for instance, in the Middle East, it's really scarce, and that makes it then more vulnerable to import, let's say, fruits, for instance, from those regions. And then with LCA, we can also assess impacts of extreme events like nuclear catastrophes, dam break in mining and oil spillages. Do you think we can do this? Maybe, actually not. So this type, also always, if there are some extreme events, you cannot do this, and this is also the reason why, for instance, nuclear power always looks very good in an LCA when you look, for instance, at the greenhouse gas emissions. But yeah, the health impacts, for instance, of the catastrophes are not taken into account. And then with LCA, you can also measure the benefits of taking action minus the costs associated with taking that action using financial matrices such as revenue earned. Is also something that you cannot do with LCA because we look at the environmental or social impacts, and this is a cost-benefit analysis actually. And yeah, here you just can see the examples again. And so, yeah, conclusively, we can say that LCA can help us here with guiding some solutions, which product should we favor and which not. For instance, we know now that if we want to reduce our climate footprint of food, don't packaging the apples in the supermarkets doesn't have such a high effect. Actually, it's rather the choice which type of products that we choose. And yeah, at the end, LCA can show here how do the results look like and what can we do. But at the end, the implementation is something that is about society, industry, and policy if we really implement it. And in science, or in my field of research, we all agree that at the end, what we need are some monetary incentives. Because actually at the moment, the incentives are rather pointing to the other direction. There are a lot of subsidies given for the animal industry, for instance. Also often the environmental friendly product costs more than the harmful product. And we do not only see this in the food industry, but also in various other industries like the transport industry, for instance. So at the end, yeah, we need those monetary incentives, can be subsidies for the right products, can be a carbon tax, for instance, also the other environmental impacts. Also in research, we also have ways to monetize environmental impacts, also to monetize impacts on biodiversity in a way that we could say what is the actual price of a product. And yes, as said, it's about the policy to implement it. And of course, the society can also choose those policymakers who implement those laws. And now, yeah, I really want to thank you for your very active participation. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm happy for questions.